And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye? And, behold, a beam is in thine own eye. Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. David prided himself on being the most observant person at his office. He worked as a project manager at a marketing firm, and nothing escaped his sharp eye. If a coworker missed a deadline, he was the first to call it out. If a presentation had a small typo, he pointed it out in front of everyone. He believed he was helping the team by keeping high standards, but in reality, most of his colleagues avoided him, dreading his harsh criticism. One Monday morning, as David sipped his coffee, he overheard two coworkers, Sarah and James, discussing an upcoming presentation. "James, you need to check your slides again," Sarah said. "You left out the quarterly revenue chart." James groaned. "I must have overlooked it. Thanks for catching that." David smirked and walked over. "James, you always overlook the details. If you can't get something as basic as a slide deck right, maybe you're in the wrong field." James looked down, well embarrassed, while Sarah frowned. Before anyone could respond, their boss, Mr. Reynolds, stepped out of his office. "David, can I see you for a moment?" David straightened his tie, confident he was about to be praised for his sharp eye. He followed Mr. Reynolds into his office and took a seat. The boss sighed and turned his monitor toward David. "I was reviewing last week's report. You know, the one you sent to the client." David nodded. "Of course. I made sure it was perfect." Mr. Reynolds clicked his mouse, and the screen displayed a glaring error on the report's first page. The client's name was misspelled. David's stomach sank. "That's not all," Mr. Reynolds continued, scrolling down. "The financial summary had outdated numbers, and the footer still had last year's date. The client caught it, not us. Do you realize how bad this looks?" David's face turned red. I must have overlooked it." Mr. Reynolds leaned back. "You're quick to catch everyone else's mistakes, David. But have you ever considered looking at your own? You pointed out a missing chart in James's slides this morning, but at least he fixed it before it went out. Your mistakes went straight to a client." David sat in stunned silence. "Listen," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice softer now. "It's good to hold high standards, but if you're only pointing fingers without self-reflection, you're not helping. You're just tearing others down. Instead of criticizing from the sidelines, why don't you start working with your team?" The words hit David harder than he expected. He had been so focused on spotting the specks in everyone else's work that he had ignored the beam in his own. That afternoon, David returned to his desk and saw James still working on his presentation. As David settled into his chair, Mr. Reynolds' words still echoed in his mind. He had spent so much time pointing out others' mistakes that he had failed to see his own. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of his realization. Then, almost out of nowhere, a memory surfaced, something he had heard in church years ago. It was a teaching of Jesus, a parable about a speck and a beam. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the beam in your own eye? First, remove the beam from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. David leaned back in his chair, stunned. He had heard those words before, but today they struck differently. It was as if they were meant for him in this very moment. He thought about the way he had treated James, Sarah, and even others in the office. He had been so focused on their small mistakes that he never considered his own flaws, his arrogance, his impatience, his lack of self-awareness. He exhaled deeply and glanced at James, who was still working diligently on his presentation. Instead of calling out mistakes from a distance, maybe it was time he started helping. Standing up, he grabbed his notepad and walked over to James. "Hey," David said, his voice softer than usual. "Want a second pair of eyes before you send this out?" James looked up, surprised. "Yeah, actually, that'd be great." As they worked together, David felt something shift inside him. He finally understood the lesson Jesus had taught. It wasn't just about judgment. It was about humility, self-awareness, and learning to help others the right way. For the first time in a long while, he didn't just want to be right. He wanted to do right